Well, hello, here we are again. This is the season of Advent where we prepare to both celebrate the first coming of Jesus, but also prepare for his second coming. Certainly the climax of this season, or the resolution even, is in Christmas. Now, a lot of, well, I can use the common term, a lot of false information has been circulated concerning the Christmas story, and I'd like to debunk some of those in the next few weeks. Today, I want to look at the supposed connection between the Christmas story and pagan practices. So, welcome back, Phil. Hello again.
Hello.
Continuing or looking at the Christmas story and some of the assumptions or claims that have been made throughout the years from supposed scholars. And I say some of these things facetiously because there's a certain standard that scholars have to meet in order to have their work recognized. And a lot of these supposed scholars are kind of on the edge and not really using proper techniques. I'm not going to name each one and go into it, but I'm going to do some generalities about their claims concerning the connection between the Christmas story and pagan practices of the time. There were a lot of pagan practices going on throughout the Roman Empire when Jesus was born, and again, there are some claim that Christianity just took some of these and incorporated it into their own practices, and they use this to try to invalidate or cast questions and aspersions upon the Christmas story and upon the life of Jesus. Supposedly, if they're just making this stuff up, how can we believe any of it? That's a line of reasoning they use. So first, a look at the Christmas story, and Phil, I'm going to ask you to read Luke 2, 1 through 7.
Sure, we've all heard this one before. Well, probably. In those days of Caesar Augustus issued a decree that a census should be taken of the entire Roman world. This was the first census that took place while Quirinius was governor of Syria, and everyone went to his own town to register. So Joseph also went up from the town of Nazareth in Galilee to Judea, to Bethlehem, the town of David, because he belonged to the house and line of David. He went there to register with Mary, who was pledged to be married to him, and was expecting a child. While they were there, the time came for the baby to be born, and she gave birth to her firstborn, a son. She wrapped him in clothes and placed him in a manger because there was no room for them in the inn.
Thank you. In a later Bible study, in a few weeks, I want to go over the details of the Christmas story and show what's been validated, what's been documented. But right now, I wanted to make a general comparison because the story of Jesus is very much an event set in history with verifiable facts. You have Caesar, and we know that he was an emperor of the Roman Empire. You have the census, and there are several censuses that could qualify for this particular one. We'll get into those details another time, but the story of Jesus is set squarely in history. By comparison, we're going to see a couple of the pagan stories had no foundation in real time. They happened somewhere out there before recorded time, possibly not even on the earth.
So you're saying because there was an actual census and there's documents of a census, or multiple censuses, and this was one of them. Censuses, I guess that's a word.
Yes, I think.
And this was one of them, that this coincides with that exact census.
Yes. Right.
A couple of things about the verse I just read. I guess I remember the line, Mary was betrothed, or whatever it is, pledged to be married to him. I guess I always assumed that they were already married before the baby was born. I guess it doesn't really matter either way because the pledge was there or the betrothing was there. But I guess it's always just been an assumption that, okay, they were pledged initially, but then they were married before, at least for me it was, before the actual child was born. Just for document's sake, I guess you'd say, just so it was on paper that he was the actual father and she was the actual mother in, Roman terms, times, I guess. And also, they removed the word swaddling. Placed him in a manger because there's she wrapped him in clothes. This verse. You would think that swaddling clothes was kind of like always the image you always got, I was waiting for the word to come up. It's like, ooh, it's not there.
Well, you can certainly add the word there, validly.
Yeah.
Validly. It was a common practice in the ancient world that when your baby was born, you wrap them very tightly.
Right.
You swaddle them, you wrap them very tightly with the idea that, well, they will develop normally now, as opposed to if you let them just wiggle around, they're going to be somehow misshapen or something. That was the belief. That was the belief.
It also keeps the child quiet because it's more like being in the womb, have
Right.
everything nice and snug and tight.
I'm sure that was also an incentive.
Yes.
And as far as Joseph and Mary being actually married, there was a custom among the Jews. It's called the betrothal period,
Okay.
where they didn't cohabitate, there were no relations, but in every other sense, they were essentially married.
Oh.
That it could only be ended by a divorce under certain circumstances. So the detail, and often the woman is called the wife.
Okay.
So there are details around it that make it sound like they were married.
Okay.
But yeah, that's a little bit of a scandalous point, and I find it interesting that nobody ever picked up on it. That Mary, well, I guess divorce was optional. It wasn't mandated, but it was certainly an option.
Yeah.
But nobody really spoke about Mary has been married 1 month and she's 7.5 months pregnant. Nobody, that never comes up.
Yeah, well, I mean, because obviously they know that maybe they were waiting for some reason. I don't know. That doesn't make sense either. 'Cause, I mean, nowadays you can just go to a justice of the peace and there you go.
Yes.
Probably like a 30-day waiting period or whatever from when you file for a license and then actually can get married. I don't remember exactly, but they couldn't do that during the time, or the time that the angel spoke to Joseph, and then they actually.
Not within the Jewish tradition, no.
Right. So they had to follow the tradition.
They had to follow the tradition, and they were good Jewish people.
Yep.
They were following the traditions happily. Another point to keep in mind is that the point of the Christmas story, too, is to document, or at least give evidence that Jesus was not Joseph's biological son.
Right.
And so if they had been married and had relations, well, then people could have claimed a biological link. But Jesus was not the biological, he was the Son of God.
Right.
And so that's just adding a little bit of evidence to that.
So he didn't want her to be touched before all this happened.
Right, right. Well, they could hold hands.
Well, yeah.
But beyond that, it's like, no.
Okay.
So good questions, good points. We'll bring some of those up later when I look at the Christmas story point for point.
Yep.
Especially those censuses. But right now I want to go back to the pagan practices and the supposed links between pagan practices and Christmas story. And I make these emphases because there's really shoddy scholarship. Take one, for example, a detail that's not in the Christmas story per se, but people claim became an early part of it, the use of evergreens and Christmas trees. We have the idea that they set up a Christmas tree in Bethlehem in the stable or something like that the practice is that old. But that's not the case. Christmas trees are a Germanic tradition that actually started in the 1800s. Didn't really become popular in our country until about 100 years ago, and it was brought over here through immigration that some Germans came to America. They brought the custom of Christmas trees, and people in this country said, hey, that's pretty nice, let's do that. But that means that the practice of evergreens stopped and then restarted almost 2,000 years later. Those that claim that the Christian church just incorporated that practice from the pagans, well, they've got to account for a 2,000-year gap in the process and show how the two are linked. That never occurs. Ideas like that usually stem from superficial similarities and presumption. Another case, again, not related to the Christmas story, but some of the stories that go around, presumptions that go around. The Celtic cross, the cross with the circle in it, some people claim came from practice of astrology. That it shows that Christianity had ties with astrology, because astrology was a circle for the seasons and so forth, and 4 points for the for the 2 solstices and the 2 equinox. Again, that's the only comparison they can really find, and circles are not difficult to identify through history for a whole lot of different things. The Celtic cross didn't come into being until about 9 or 1000 AD. So again, you have to find some direct link between the practices of the early church and the use of a circle concerning astrology and the Celtic cross, and somehow make it span that 1,000 years. Again, there is no evidence of that. It's just a presumptuous thing and unfounded, based on presumption and people wanting to discredit Christmas, really. And again, they say that, well, if all these practices came from pagan practices, then some of the story has to be made up. We really can't believe the original story if all these things came from pagan practices. That's sort of the line of reasoning. The one practice that gets a lot of attention in our culture today is the practice and the assumed connection between Christmas and Saturnalia. Saturnalia was a Roman holiday. It was a high holiday initially that the Romans would celebrate on a regular basis. It started on December 17th. It was a holiday to Saturn, hence the title, hence the name. Started on December 17th, and it eventually stretched out to the 24th. In its glory, in its heyday, it lasted a whole week, but before that it was only a day or a few days. And again, people say, well, Saturnalia, Christmas, they're pretty close. Christians must have come up with this to fill the gap from the pagans in Saturnalia. Well, there's a few problems with that. First, Saturnalia is a week. Christmas is one day. And I failed to see how one day after the event is going to make up for a week-long practice.
Well, a week-long practice, that's more like the lighting of the candles for Hanukkah.
For Hanukkah, true.
Yeah.
Although Hanukkah doesn't really have a good connection with Saturnalia. No one's ever made a connection between Hanukkah and Saturnalia.
All right.
Although that is a good correlation. You'd make a good historian.
Yeah. No, not really. I'm just making stuff up as I go.
So do they. Just got to get paid for it now.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, really. But 7 days versus 1 day. The next problem with that is Saturnalia was pretty much a time of meaningless buffoonery. There's a poet whose name I can't find right offhand. Okay, I'll find that later, but there is a poet who described the practice of Saturnalia And he said, essentially, well, he was the king of his household. You would appoint a king and a queen, and they would have full rule. But what would happen during Saturnalia is that your servants would become masters of the house, and the masters of the house would serve the slaves, serve the servants. There would be copious amounts of drinking. There would be singing. Actually, he states there'd be naked singing, and also dunking people's head in icy cold water when the time seemed appropriate. Doesn't sound anything like Christmas. Doesn't sound like anything trying to replace the birth of Jesus.
Or Hanukkah. For that.
Or Hanukkah, yeah, I know, right? Even the most liberal of Jews, that's not Hanukkah. So, yeah, the attempt to relate the two is quite a stretch. Next, another reason that doesn't make sense is that history does show that some Christians did celebrate Saturnalia and Christmas. So if the one's trying to take the place of the other, why would they celebrate both? It's something that crossed over, that didn't exclude each other.
When was that originated, I guess is the word.
Saturnalia?
Yeah.
Probably about 400 or 500 BC.
Okay.
In its early nascent stages.
Right.
And obviously it died out when the Roman Empire did.
Okay.
Which was probably 3rd, 4th century.
Yep.
It was at least in decline then. But Christmas went on. There's also it's a fact which is recognized but debated about how extreme or how widespread it was, that Saturnalia included human sacrifice. And in its earlier stages, yes, it did, but most scholars agree that by the time of Jesus' birth and after, it was very, very seldom celebrated that way. But human sacrifice was practiced in other religions at that time. Romans, it is said, since they practiced human sacrifice during the holiday, and since the Christians were being persecuted, well, they often made a Christian the sacrifice for Saturnalia. Not really good documentation on that, I will admit, but if there's any foundation in that, it seems really unlikely that Christians would take that holiday and turn it into something else. I think they would just scorn Saturnalia completely and ignore it. It would be a horrendous and grotesque thing to do. And why would they still celebrate it? That's kind of like the Jews having a holiday for the Holocaust. A happy holiday. I know that the Jews do recognize the Holocaust, but it's in a celebration, in a rite that's very solemn, not at all festive. So again, the connection between Christmas and Saturnalia is, well, okay, they happened at the same time, but that's about all you can say. That's about it.